The nuclear-powered submarine capability that South Korea is pursuing in some ways is like a Rorschach test. So it's a very powerful capability, new military capability. Whether you're South Korean or American for that matter, you can say, hey, this is great. But it does require vigilance.
들을수록 똑똑해지는 지식 뉴스!
The next one is on nuclear-powered submarines to fulfill President Trump's commitment in a deliberate manner. And I think it's a reflection of something I said, that the president wants allies to be strong.
최근에 한국 정부에서 핵 잠수함을 이제 미국과 같이 이제 건조를 하기로 결정을 했는데 굉장히 중국 겨냥용으로 활용이 될 것이 아니냐.
맞아요. But the nuclear-powered submarine capability that South Korea is pursuing in some ways is like a Rorschach test, that blot, where how you interpret it says as much about you and what's on your mind. So it's a very powerful capability, new military capability, and any capability can change in its function as the intentions change, right? And so if you're looking at South Korea with a view that China is the adversary, whether you're South Korean or American for that matter, you can say, hey, this is great. If South Korea gets this nuclear-powered sub, they can use that against China. China at least has to worry, where's the South Korean sub? And so it is natural that there are, well, first of all, there are people that hope that this sub actually will be used in some way as a deterrent against China, at least to worry China. And there are those who would fear it. At this current stage, it is not my view that the nuclear-powered sub for South Korea is principally about China. I think there are two other audiences, if you want. It's a strange word. But if you think about the submarine as a kind of military performance, I see two audiences for it. The first one, not surprisingly, is North Korea. And if you're following North Korea, superficially, you might only know about the nuclear weapons. They have an arsenal of over 60 weapons, we think, at this point. And you'd know about the missile tests, the ICBMs, but also the ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles that can hit targets easily now within the region, Japan and South Korea. But what you may be not as aware of is the advancements that are happening in North Korea's naval capabilities. Building on the fact that already military analysts consider North Korea to have a pretty formidable submarine fleet. The technology is older, and a lot of these are very small subs, but the estimates are something like 70 or more submarines, more than South Korea.
북한이 핵 잠수함을 보유했다고 선포한 이상 대한민국도 거기에 상응하는 전력을 가져야 된다는 것에.
So, apart from the nuclear weapons and the missiles, submarine warfare is actually one of the few areas where North Korea looks like they're a little bit ahead of South Korea. Recently, Kim Jong-un has kind of moved this to the next stage. He has visited shipyards in North Korea. He's visited shipyards in Russia. And this is where we have to bring in the military alliance between North Korea and Russia. The fact that, as we all know, North Korea has been supplying significant amount of ammunition, weaponry, and then even soldiers to fight in Russia's war against Ukraine. They're not doing that out of brotherly love. It's a quid pro quo, and they're getting things back from the Russians. And one of the things, there's good evidence out there to suggest that the North Koreans are getting back is help with their naval capabilities, including Kim Jong-un announced North Korea was building a nuclear-powered submarine, right?
북한과 러시아 간의 군사적인 협력에 대해서는 저희가 계속 살펴보고 있고.
And so the principal audience, I think, for South Korea to do this is the kind of most obvious one. It's about keeping up with North Korea, not allowing North Korea to get yet another asymmetrical advantage. They already have one in terms of nuclear weapons, which South Korea does not possess. South Korea doesn't want to see that happening with naval capabilities. The second audience is a little less obvious. I think that's the United States. Because in this context of US allies having to worry about the credibility of United States support, South Korea is particularly exposed. South Korea faces a nuclear-armed hostile country to the north and is surrounded by other nuclear powers, China and Russia, and even Japan, which is not nuclear but is a large country with a formidable military that South Korea has a complicated relationship with. So South Korea lives in a very tough neighborhood and has relied for many, many decades on some level of credibility that the United States will be there in a pinch, including with nuclear weapons. That's what's called extended deterrence. The idea that the United States will provide the nuclear weaponry if necessary, defend South Korea against a nuclear armed attack, and therefore South Korea doesn't need its own nuclear weapons. Well, the psychological faith that South Koreans have had for many decades in that American extended deterrence is really weakening. And, we saw that in the last president, President Yoon Suk-yeol, who openly talked about South Korea maybe needing to consider getting a nuclear weapon. Now, of course, his presidency ended very, very badly. So we come back to the nuclear-powered submarine. It's not a nuclear-armed submarine, it's nuclear-powered. But it is another step in the direction of South Korea developing the spectrum of capabilities that it needs to achieve at least nuclear latency, being able to easily become a nuclear-armed state, if not outright develop its own nuclear weapons, its own nuclear deterrent. In a way, developing a nuclear-powered sub is kind of like boiling the frog slowly as far as the United States is concerned. Sort of getting Americans used to the idea of, South Korea is slowly going nuclear. They got that sub, that seems to be working well, right? And so I think that's why the second audience is actually America. Now, one day, we may be in a world, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 30, 50 years, where there is serious conflict between, say, the United States and China. And the question of what is South Korea going to do with its mini fleet of nuclear-powered, for that matter, nuclear-armed submarines, is going to be one of the top 10 issues in that conflict scenario. So I'm not dismissing the future significance of this capability to the balance of power with China, but I would say that is not in the immediate and in the near term. I don't think that's principally what this is about.
중국 입장에서 사실 굉장히 불편할 거라고 생각이 되는데, 근데 이번에 중국이 굉장히 좀 조용한 것 같아요. 그 이유가 뭔지 묻고 싶습니다.
글쎄요. It's the dog that's not barking. Why is Beijing not more upset at South Korea for developing its own nuclear-powered submarine as compared with, what was that, less than 10 years ago when South Korea announced, we are going to bring in this US missile system, THAAD, and all hell broke loose. And China was furious about it. And China punished South Korea over a US military capability that came on the peninsula. Well, actually, I think that's right there a hint, because if you think about it, there's some differences between THAAD and the nuclear-powered sub. THAAD was and is a US missile defense system. And when it came into Korea, that's a US system getting closer to China. China did not like it. China didn't like the radar capabilities connected with THAAD, and they pushed hard very back. They pushed back hard against South Korea, not against the United States. And at that point, actually, I was visiting China pretty regularly, and I remember talking with some Chinese experts and analysts, and I said, look, why are you beating up South Korea? This is a US capability. And they said, well, it's no point trying to beat up America over this. They're going to do it. But we might be able to get some leverage with South Korea. That was interesting. That was the argument anyway. I think that when the Chinese, when the dust settled and they look back on it, they were not very successful, first of all, with THAAD. It did not work very well as a diplomatic effort. THAAD is still here. So I think that, first of all, there was a recognition in China that it backfired a little bit, or certainly it wasn't very effective as a way to beat up on the South Koreans. Ultimately, it really strengthened the South Korean will and consensus. Yeah, we probably should keep this if the Chinese are so upset about it. So that's one point of difference between THAAD and the nuclear-powered sub. But there's an even more important difference, I think, from the Chinese perspective, because this submarine that we're talking about is not strengthening the US ROK alliance. This submarine is symptomatic of the weakening of the US-South Korea alliance. South Korea wants it because South Korea is worried, can we really count on the Americans? The Americans looks like they're going to let it happen because implicitly they're saying, no, you really can't count on us. You better develop that, and we'll start loosening restrictions to let you develop it. And also, we don't care about nuclear non-proliferation like we used to. We're making deals with the Australians. We're not mentioning this in our national security strategy at all. So it's a new world, and you know what, South Korea? Yeah, you better be able to watch yourself and get your own back. The nuclear-powered sub is about South Korean strategic autonomy. It is not about the US-South Korea alliance. And I think the Chinese get that. And so from a Chinese perspective, this is less threatening than THAAD was. It is not a US capability coming closer to the Chinese border. It's about a neighboring country, a middle power, that you have a pretty good political relationship with, that is moving further in the direction of strategic autonomy. That is to say, moving further away from the United States. And so if the Chinese are smart, they are not going to scream and cry about this and actually strengthen South Korean public opinion in a kind of anti-China direction. They're just quietly letting this one go.
핵 추진 잠수함이 한국과 미국의 결속을 강화시키는 게 아니고 되려 좀 더 약간 떨어뜨려졌다. 그러니까 한국이 독립적으로 네가 알아서 지켜라는 의미로 말씀을 하신 거죠.
맞아요. This capability, a nuclear-powered sub for South Korea, is giving South Korea more strategic autonomy. It's a capability that South Korea can decide how to use. It involves technologies that the United States has not been willing to share. And so it's symptomatic of a weakening of the alliance, not a strengthening of the alliance.
트럼프 정부의 그 국가안보전략 NSS가 발표가 됐는데요. 여기서 저희가 주목해야 할 포인트가 있을지, 또 특히 한국에 미칠 영향은 뭘지가 궁금합니다.
Well, to understand this national security strategy, I think we have to zoom out first and look at the big picture of what it tells us about the Trump administration foreign policy going forward. I think of it as someone who is picking a couple fights, bar fights. We know that Trump is very combative. He likes, the kind of fighting style, wrestling. But he also only wants to get in a fight he thinks he's going to win. The first fight is Latin America. There's a major emphasis in this document on the Western Hemisphere, on American dominance of the Western Hemisphere. It talks about the Monroe Doctrine, which is something from 19th century American history that Trump is bringing back by saying, I now have a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said European powers are not allowed to interfere in the countries of Latin America. The Trump corollary, which is actually the same as the old Roosevelt corollary from Theodore Roosevelt, is not only can no one interfere in this hemisphere, but we, the United States government, will interfere. We will police the countries of Latin America as we wish. And that focus on Latin America is consistent with Trump's focus on the border, defending the border, stopping immigrants, stopping drugs. And of course, we are seeing actual warfare playing out in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Pacific. The second fight, a little bit less predictably, is Europe. Europe gets a major emphasis in this strategy document. And here, instead of actual war, what Trump wants is culture war. He's basically extending American culture war across the Atlantic and saying America is going to fight to defend Western civilization from what they say is civilizational erasure in Europe. This is where the document becomes very ideological, but this is a big focus of Trump foreign policy, is sort of getting involved in European culture and politics and defending what they see as Western civilization. You need to pay attention to the focus on Latin America and Europe to realize Asia, the Indo-Pacific, the Korean Peninsula are way down the list of strategic priorities. In fact, one of the most striking things about, from a Korean perspective, I would say probably the most striking feature of the national security strategy is the complete omission of North Korea. It is not mentioned even once. If you go back and look at Trump's first national security strategy, do you know how many times North Korea was mentioned in that document? 16. From 16 to 0, right? It's the complete erasure of North Korea and denuclearization of North Korea as a priority for President Trump. You know, from a South Korean perspective, I would say the most important inference that you draw from this document is we are not a priority. We are way down the list of priorities. 왜 그랬을까요? Is the relationship good now between the US and DPRK, between North Korea and South Korea? No, none of these things. Quite the opposite. North Korea has more bombs, better means to deliver those weapons against the United States and against targets across the region. North-South relations on the Korean Peninsula are very bad. They're worse than they were before. But it's mentioned 16 times in 2017, and it's not mentioned once in 2025. Why is that? The simplest way I can explain the answer is that Donald Trump thought in 2017, that's a fight I want. That's a fight I can win. At least I can look like I win that fight. And maybe it doesn't mean I actually get rid of the nuclear weapons. But first of all, people like this fight of me and Kim Jong-un. It was amazing clickbait. It was a global media frenzy. So Trump can win even just by getting a lot of attention. And he got that in the kind of fight with North Korea. But to give Donald Trump some credit, he genuinely tried to negotiate directly with Kim Jong-un, both in Singapore and even at their second meeting in Hanoi. Donald Trump really did try his best to use the art of the deal and to convince Kim Jong-un to give up some large amount of his nuclear weapons in return for getting sanctions lifted and other things. And he couldn't seal the deal. He doesn't want to try again. He doesn't want to try again. He knows he can't get that deal from Kim Jong-un. And Trump has just lost interest. You know, he has a pretty good sense of what will get attention, or the show that people want to see. And I think in his view, that's an old episode. And people don't want to see that episode anymore. The whole Trump-Kim, my fingers on the button, it's played out. And so he simply tells his people, don't mention North Korea in this national security strategy. Now, the only silver lining you could say to all this is that the good thing here, Donald Trump is not trying to pick a fight with Kim Jong-un. And in fact, as we've seen, if you ask him, like President Lee Jae-myung asked him, if you bring up North Korea, he'll say, oh, I'd love to meet with Kim Jong-un. Yeah. And if he comes to this region, he'll say, oh, it'd be great to meet with Kim Jong-un. And that maybe helps a little bit to keep the tensions down somewhat. But it's not a serious effort to solve the problem. And that's why it's not mentioned in the security strategy. You know Jenga? That kind of tower of wooden bricks. And when I try to think like a historian about where are we right now, that image comes to mind, principally because of the United States and because of the fundamental changes in the mindset, the philosophy of America's role in the world, including America's role in this region of the world. It's like there's a Jenga tower. And that Jenga tower in East Asia is peace. East Asia has not seen large-scale warfare in a very long time. Basically, you have to go back to the 1970s. So that Jenga tower is peace, and it's like there's a piece down here, and it's just being pulled out. And we're all watching, wondering, are they really going to pull it all the way out? And it does require vigilance. For me, and I'm an American, but I've lived outside of America, and I've lived in this region for many years and made it home. I've lived in Europe, so I'm a citizen of the world. To me, the question is, are we trying to stop the hand that's about to pull that piece out? Or do we have to be ready to put another piece right in as it comes out? Either one of those is going to be incredibly difficult. And I don't have the solution. For now, we all need to pay a lot of attention. And South Koreans, for sure, need to be paying a lot of attention to this stuff. 교양이를 부탁해. 오늘 여기까지 있습니다. 수업 끝났어요. 감사합니다, 여러분.